and thank you for joining us this morning at the end of July. We will be recording this session, so just to let you know that it is important. And we are very excited. I think this is our third In Conversations With webinar. Today we have as our guest Miles Crisp. Miles Crisp is currently the Group CEO for Tarsus Technologies. In talking to Miles before the session, I discovered that Miles is deeply curious about being effective as a leader and very interested in this whole topic of leadership, specifically enabling people to grow and have a positive experience of work. Miles has extensive experience of the legitimate leadership framework, having implemented it within Tarsus Technologies, or implemented the principles. We teach it, Miles does it. That was my tagline for this. And Tarsus has been on a 6-year program implementing these fundamentals of care and growth, which Miles believes has really had a positive impact on his business during this COVID-19 crisis and in how they've dealt with this response. I will give Miles an opportunity to correct anything that I got wrong there in a few minutes. We also have Wendy Lambourne on the call. Wendy is the founder of Legitimate Leadership. Wendy has been working with these concepts for 30 years now, and in fact introduced me to the framework almost 20 years ago. So welcome, Wendy. Wendy has been using these principles in organizations to affect transformation across those organizations in places as far afield as the US and Canada, right through Europe and Africa to China. So Wendy is here today to share her extensive experience of how people lead and how people, we believe, should go about leading in a crisis. We're going to start off today by asking Wendy to please share some of what Legitimate Leadership believes about leading in a crisis. And then I'm going to move on to asking Miles about how he sees these things evidenced in the real world which he inhabits. And finally, I'm going to allow for about 20 minutes for questions at the end. So please submit your questions in the chat. Alternatively, just put your hand up or unmute yourself and shout something out. Anything goes in these sessions, and I look forward to a compelling discussion. Right, Wendy, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Ian. What I'm going to do is really put up 6 statements, if you like, each one of those really stating what legitimate leadership believes, if you like, when it comes to leading in a crisis. And I'm really trying to put these ideas forth, almost to provide a bit of a context for Miles to then either agree or disagree with our views. And if he agrees, perhaps it would be very helpful, I think, for him to share how he's actually been leading, particularly during this COVID crisis, in a way that is consistent, if you like, with the legitimate leadership views. So here's the first one. There's nothing like a crisis to bring the chickens home to roost. But I did say roast because that's what a chief shop steward said to me. He put his finger under my nose, looked me in the eye and said, now the chickens are going to come home to roost or roast. And he wasn't wrong. In other words, what we're really saying here is you reap what you sow. In other words, in a crisis, people either rally or scatter. And our view is which of the two they do is a function of leadership's intent. So if you like, if historically leadership has been in a relationship to give to their people, when a crisis comes about, people come to the fore and they literally do anything they possibly can to help steer the ship through stormy seas. Conversely, if historically, from a leadership point of view, you've been in a relationship to take from your people, then don't be surprised if in fact they don't rise to the occasion. They do little, if anything, and maybe they even jump ship during a crisis. Second statement, what leaders say and do as a crisis may be forgiven but not forgotten. In other words, what you both say as a leader and what you do in a crisis is all important. And there's a guy called David Ulrich, and I think he puts it rather nicely when he says, the stress of a crisis magnifies actions and creates lingering memories. In other words, as leaders, we're always, if you like, being observed. But I think in a crisis, we come under increasing scrutiny from our people. And how we actually act in what I always experience in a crisis situation, a series of almost defining moments in the crisis, can lead to one of two possibilities going forward. The one is, I think it can literally lead to an irretrievable breakdown in trust in the relationship. So in other words, the relationship might survive, but it's never going to be the same again. Conversely, I think if leaders do the right thing in a crisis, they literally can create conditions where they will have captured the hearts and minds of their people, perhaps in a way that they've never done before. Thirdly, there's a list of attributes, if you Google it, for what leaders need to have in a crisis. And quite frankly, the list is so long that you would, looking at it, decide to give up in advance. From a legitimate leadership point of view, we believe that there are really only two essential must-haves for leaders in a crisis. Those two must-haves are compassion and courage, and in that order. And I think what's important about this is that these qualities are in fact a matter of choice. In other words, you choose to either be compassionate or indifferent to your people's circumstances in crisis. Similarly, you choose courage over cowardice in the crisis. And if these then are a choice or a matter of the will, what this means that if you don't display those qualities in a crisis, from a leadership point of view, you have no one to blame but yourself. Our view is it's absolutely imperative that you do so, because leaders that are really revered in a crisis have this combination, if you like, of both a soft and a brave heart. It's obviously clear, and we're back to the theme of trust again, that people only care for people who care for them. And in this COVID crisis in particular, this care and care for our people has obviously been brought into sharp focus. And it's a key test for leadership at this time. And our view is that the majority of people in leadership roles in the organizations we work with are passing this test with flying colors. But the important thing from our point of view, there are two things here. The first is that care means more than simply looking after people's physical and material needs during a crisis. And we think about this as essentially there are three care gives as a leader. And they are, as it says on the screen there, the first is not just that you give your people time and attention, but that you increase the degree of time and attention you give to people, simply because you give your time and attention to things that you care about. The second give is a give in terms of honesty. And honesty in our book doesn't mean just not lying to people. It actually means trusting them with perhaps sensitive information and being prepared to disclose that information to them so that they in turn can demonstrate their trustworthiness. And the third give is a give with respect to showing genuine concern for people's personal circumstances at this time. But the give is tough love. In other words, from our experience, it's very important how you care, because you can care in a way that is enabling and helps build strong people, or you can care in a way that breeds dependency and in fact makes people weak, not strong in a crisis. This one, and if I said that leaders seem to be passing the care test in the COVID crisis, well, our experience is they're certainly not doing anywhere near as well when it comes to passing the growth test. In other words, there seems to be almost an instinctive response in a crisis for people in leadership to actually take back control. And sort of in simple terms, I think people are looking to leadership to save them in this crisis, and leaders therefore rise to the occasion and do what they think is the right thing to do, which is to step in and save the day. In our view, that's not the right thing to do. So we think you should empower, not control in a crisis. But we think that you will only do this if you are very deliberate about doing it. And deliberately empowering people in our minds means the following, that whilst you may hold on to policy and strategy decisions, all other decisions you push as far down the line as possible. It means that you resist doing and instead empower your managers to empower their managers to ultimately empower the employees to do. It means that you increase, and there's so many opportunities for this in a crisis, but to increase people's responsibilities so that you can in fact accelerate their growth in the crisis. It also means that once the crisis is over, you resist taking back the authority that you have pushed down the line. Even more importantly, that you resist resurrecting all of the controls and the reporting that you were doing before the crisis. Because so many of those things fall away in a crisis. And I think you have to question yourselves as to whether really you need all these things now the crisis is over. And finally, leaders seem to make very decisive decisions with limited information in a crisis. We believe that they should, in fact, continue to do so. And finally, what legitimate leaders do in a crisis, first and foremost, is look at themselves. Where I'm coming from here is really saying that I think, and this is not only true in a crisis, but who you are as a leader, and in particular, and this is why we wanted Miles to come in today, I think who you are as a CEO is simply reflected in the organization around you. Who you are equals what your organization is actually all about. So if that is the case, then in fact, what leaders should do in a crisis, first and foremost, is look to themselves and, if you like, make themselves the project. In our view, in a crisis, the leader's intent is revealed, and the crisis then provides a golden opportunity, almost, if you like, to polish your own intent as a leader and to set the example for others to follow. In the process, and again, I really would like Miles to comment on this, because we said as a byline to the invite here that in a crisis, more than anyone else, the person who grows is the leader. I would very much like to hear from Miles how he has grown leading Tarsus Technologies through this crisis. Right. Thanks, Ian.
Right, thanks, Wendy. Can you please put the next slide up? Yeah. So in preparing for this conversation, we agreed that to get through all 6 points would take far too long and wouldn't allow enough time for question. In fact, we concluded that you could talk about each of these points for at least an hour. So somewhere in the middle, we decided to focus on 3 of these. The first one, there's nothing like a crisis to bring the chickens home to roost. The 5th one, the more leaders empower their people in a crisis, the more they are trusted by their people. And lastly, what legitimate leaders do in a crisis, first and foremost, is look at themselves, and they make themselves the project. Basically, the focus for today is more on the empowerment, courage, trust side of leadership rather than the care, generosity, and compassion side. Miles, the lazy question is, so what do you think? But I'm going to be a little bit more specific than that. Wendy started by saying that there is nothing like a crisis to bring the chickens home to roost. Would you agree with that statement? And if so, what evidence have you seen during the COVID crisis to make us believe that this is in fact true?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It's quite extraordinary actually seeing a summary from legitimate leadership and from Wendy of these 6 points, because it's almost frightening how accurate they are and how relevant they've been. And I don't think we at Tarsus had unpacked them quite as neatly and thought about them as deliberately, in a sense. But the fact is, we've been working on our leadership structure for over 6 years now. There were major reorganization about 6.5 years ago. We merged a whole lot of companies together and brought them in, and there was a complete overhaul in leadership and new appointments. And we deliberately adopted the legitimate leadership framework. Back then, as we referred to it, the Care and Growth Framework, and we involved the entire organization in workshops for a period of about 18 months, just to try and understand what kind of organization we wanted to be. So this was separate from the strategic work we were doing. It was about, what kind of heart did we want to be focused on this whole issue of intent and trust. And accountability was important to us, and we involved people in the whole accountability framework around means, ability, and accountability, and we drove it. So it's interesting. You never really know in a measurable way how that is impacting you or not. Over the period, we have gradually reduced numbers of personnel in the organization and become more focused at what we do, and it's become quite a lot leaner organization. And then, of course, suddenly March arrived, and we had an inkling that some kind of lockdown was coming. You just had to look north to Europe, and we made the decision to move people home about 10 days before the formal lockdown came. And in a situation like that, it's quite chaotic. You don't know if your systems are up to it. You don't know if the networks are designed properly. People don't have the appropriate equipment necessarily. There's a desktop, there's a notebook, computer versus somebody who might have a desktop that's not got a battery in it and doesn't have there's connectivity issues. You have staff that can't afford data. Do you pay for their data? Don't you? You have people going into areas that need to be tested. They're working off 3G cards and all sorts of things. So we moved 450 people off site, and by the way, subsequently have decided to leave them permanently off site. But about 450 people were affected, and we moved in the space of 3 days. Now, if you are a leader in that situation, there are so many moving parts and there's so much going on, not just technically, but just socially, teams, knowing where everybody is, and then of course also policy-wise, how do you handle it from the kinds of policies that you need to examine and do. And it's absolutely impossible to work in a command and control or centralize, or as Wendy said, to take control of the situation. It's actually just not possible. You have to stand by, and as the leader, what the anxiety that I personally experienced was that I didn't feel as if I was doing enough. I wasn't personally busy enough. I wasn't personally involved, and I realized that this anxiety, every day as this massive change happened, that it was the ultimate in surrender to the leaders in your organization, and as Wendy also said, to push it right down to the individual level, where you are now absolutely subject to the ingenuity of your own people, down to an individual level, and even quite junior people who've got to figure out for themselves what it is that they've got to do in these circumstances when you take 3 days to send people home and then start gradually to regroup. And that's when I realized the huge insight was that if we hadn't been working and talking deliberately, as Wendy says, this is not an accident. If we hadn't been deliberately working on trust and holding people accountable to trust their subordinates, and first to trust, senior down. In a hierarchy, trust has to start top down. You have to give the trust first before you can expect to be trusted. And we have been talking about this at Tarsus again and again and again for 6 years. And we've been holding people accountable to behaviors that do this. The ultimate empowerment of your staff is not just learning and equipment and training and technical capability. If you are not trusted, you're not empowered. And then what I also realized is that we were taking decisions and just sending notes, even WhatsApp group notes, through to our board and the non-exec directors. A really simple example would be, what kind of policy do you have now around working hours, people who are taking kids home, looking after small children, and what policy do you have around sick leave, different forms of leave? What if some people, some people were sent home, but they were not capable of working from home because their roles were not suitable. So, if you've got staff in a big warehouse driving forklifts and you send half of them home, they can't drive a forklift around at home. So did we put them onto half pay or leave, or did we, and there are all these little minute decisions compared with somebody, say, in the finance department that is suddenly confronted with an online audit, as we were, who's working 18 hours a day. Do we pay them differently? Do we do different things? And what you find is that if you trust your people and you're trusted, coming to conclusions on this, fair conclusions, because it's not that person who can't work from home's fault that they can't work from home. And we instantly agreed that they should all be paid as normal. Nobody was going to be forced to take leave. Let's just let the dust settle. There was no debate. We didn't have to call board meetings and have dissenting voices. We were able to make decisions around difficult things. We instantly created a kind of COVID leave, because you don't want people being afraid that they're going to take up all their sick leave for a year because they're coughing and then coming to work sick, because we did have to have some people come to the premises. What I realized as an observer, as a person standing by, watching my teams at all levels just get on with it, myself driving home, to work and trying to do this remotely, instantly, and not even being there to see the bedlam that was happening, and it wasn't bedlam. The organization got themselves home and operating without skipping a beat. And then lockdown came, and we knew that we were going to have an entire month with almost zero sales. Now, Tarsus is an organization that moves about R500 million worth of IT equipment every month. And it's got a 6-week lead time. So, it's got the cost of sales, your purchases piling up at Durban port. It's on its way, a ship is coming, and it's got to be paid for. And you can't sell it and move it in, and it's going to be blocked at customs. And so the other thing is to talk about not seeing yourself as the project. You cannot panic. You have to really very quickly sit down and understand what are the big issues, what are the priorities, what can sink you. In our case, the thing that could sink us was the bank, because the bank decided that whatever facility we had extended at the time of the lockdown, that was going to be it. There's going to be no more. So never mind legal agreements and extra funding that we thought was available. It was gone. Overnight, it was gone. The stock that piled up in Durban, by the time we had to pay for it, we had to pay 390 million rand more for it than we thought we had to pay for it when we ordered, because of the deterioration in the rand. That's just sucked out of your cash flow overnight, completely out of your control. So there were enough bits and pieces in this to generate panic in anybody. And I realized quickly that my job, my main job, actually was just to be calm, understand what these different moving parts were, and just gradually and gently ask the right questions and push the right questions into the organization, and quite literally stand in awe, absolute awe, of the power that was unleashed by over 700 people who just got on with it. Not a complaint, not one complaint. It was just extraordinary. And then, you know, it was to realize that all the prior year's work at building the trust, at building the communication, that people would just get on with their role. And then we sat down as a very small exco. We have a tiny exco, 7 people. And we sat down and we started crafting communication plans, and we started cascading the communication at different levels. And I started communicating personally to everybody. We used email, we used video clips, we used Zoom sessions, we used SMSs, and we had our very small communications team just click in, and we sat with each other more than weekly, and we battled like hell to get the connectivity, to do the clips, to get coached on this. And we just realized that we had to share a lot of data. We had to share the bad news and the good news, and we had to just promise people that we were working on these things. And you know, I've actually saved in my emails the thank you letters that we got from individuals, and that I personally got from people saying, just thank you so much. You know, we know you're doing your best for us, and we can see this, and how are you doing? You know, I had questions of people saying, how are you doing? You know, and I was doing fine, absolutely fine. So I think that's a summary. I don't want to hog the floor. I know you've got other questions to ask and get going, but you know, just to think about these chickens coming home to roost, to see an organization turn on a tiki and get people home and functioning. By the way, the other thing that I'll just leave you with is that we then had the stock piled up in Durban, that by the end of April, and we had customers. Our biggest customer is JD Group, so Incredible Connection and Hi-Fi Corporation specifically. And, you know, we had permission to open when we moved to level 4 on the 1st of May, and they wanted their stores stocked and ready to go. So this was a question of getting stock through customs onto shippers. We changed shippers in the middle of this, getting it booked into our warehouse and getting it delivered out again. So the coordination, the logistic coordination to move more, well, over a period of 2 weeks was about 700 million rands worth of goods through a warehouse just straight after lockdown. And just to see the organization pile in, the collaboration with suppliers, the collaboration with the shippers, with the trucking companies, with our customers, the solving of the crises that came in there, the trust that we had to have around how we would, the quotes that were outstanding from our side that had been done at under 14 Rand to the dollar, and this stuff was coming in at 19 Rand to the dollar. How did we deal with it? Where did we, getting legal advice on that? Did we need to honor our commitments and so on, because it could sink us? And just to see all, and I couldn't make all of these decisions. There were way too many decisions to be made just flying around in an organization. And my team will tell you, if you ask them, that I used to go to them and say, you know, can't you give me more work? I'm feeling that I'm not doing enough. But of course, you know, I had to think about and deliberately get on with the communication to people and so on, and let our people do their work. And they did. They really, really did. We're in great shape. We're in better shape now. By the way, we also did need, sadly, to retrench about 100 people during this lockdown period, and for many of them, their last month was June, and all of that, and that had to go on at the same time, and you know, a very small HR team that had to get on with this, and so it was an extraordinary experience on every level, and you know, other than the real sadness of the retrenchments that have happened, an extremely gratifying experience where we have so improved as an organization and become aware our strengths and weaknesses in a very graphic way, and been able to let people get on with doing their work. So back to you, Ian. You know, that's a long soliloquy, but maybe it summarizes these points, the 3 points that are up, you know, in a more mixed way.
Yeah. Miles, thank you. And you're not off the hook yet, because we have a lot more questions for you. But you piqued interest for me. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to ask Wendy to just join the conversation here. And the question I've got is, you spoke about trust and the fact that when you trust people, they trust you, etc. But you also mentioned trust with suppliers, trust with your customers. Are all of these different types of trust correlated? Is it possible or likely that you're going to have high trust with your employees but no trust with your customers, that kind of thing? Wendy, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is trust a kind of constant across your business, or do you focus on little bits of trust at a time?
Yeah, sorry, you broke up there slightly, Ian, but I mean, just...
sorry, Wendy, can I just interrupt? Do you mind taking the presentation down so we can see you talking? Yeah, great.
That works?
So,
okay.
So my question here is about trust, and are these different kinds of trust correlated in any way? I mean, are you likely to get good trust with your employees but no trust with your customers or suppliers, that kind of thing?
Well, I think, you know, this whole idea of, you know, how the other party perceives your intent determines how they respond to you is true in any relationship. And I guess if I'm going to be really personal about it now, I can assure you that those clients of legitimate leadership who stayed with us through this crisis, those are the kinds of people that I undoubtedly know that legitimate leadership is not just going to do a good job for them. We'll go above and beyond in every way we possibly can. So I do believe it doesn't matter what the relationship, if the intent in the relationship is to give, the natural and instinctive response of the other party is to want to give back in spades.
Yeah.
So in Miles' context here, Miles, what I hear you saying is that over the last 6 years, you've worked exceptionally hard, not only in the relationship with your employees, but also with your suppliers, also with your customers, also with the people that you report into, to just consistently give appropriately in the relationship. And it sounds like not only your employees, but everyone else has come to the party as a result.
Yes, and maybe, you know, I suppose sometimes one's got to be careful in how we explain these things. But you know, there was one supplier to us that we didn't experience the same level of trust, and it was our bank, and they tried to micromanage us. They wanted lists of all of our disbursements by day, and at one point they stopped payments to suppliers of ours without telling us. And even though we were hundreds of millions of rand, you know, under our actual formal facility with them, and this was done on the basis of somebody there and some faceless person within a large organization said, you know, well, that's it, just limit the facility. Let's limit it there. And you know, we found out by examining our own bank statements the next day that certain suppliers hadn't been paid. Now we work fastidiously and fanatically on maintaining trust with our suppliers, because our suppliers are large multinationals, and there isn't a huge amount of camaraderie and so on when you're paying people in Switzerland and New York and so on for your supplies. I mean, this happens really very mechanically, and if you miss a payment or don't work within credit terms and so on, then you can invite all sorts of adverse consequences. So we were mortified. You know, I was on the phone to one of the director level at the bank at 9 o'clock at night, and and just saying you can't do this. So what was extraordinary was the one relationship where we discovered trust was damaged consumed almost 60-70% of my time. All of the other relationships where trust existed, and by trust, I don't mean everything was fine. It didn't mean there wasn't conflict. It didn't mean we weren't asking each other hard questions. It was really more about being honest with each other and sharing good and bad news and solving problems together. So this isn't all, kumbaya kind of trust with people. This was, but I could just let that go and focus on the one relationship that could do us the most harm. And then I realized I had one of our non-exec directors just calmly remind me, he said, Miles, let's just work at restoring the trust, and what will it take to restore the trust. And we then embarked on it took about 3-4 weeks where we had to just sit with them and quietly say, we can get you this information, but not that. We're running the business, not you. If you want to come and run it, you come and run it. And we had some incredibly tough conversations with them, and the relationship is now extraordinary. I'd say there's more trust and more knowledge of what they need. Once I understood what their fear was, once I'd deliberately put the emotions aside and said, where are they coming from? What's their problem? What's their fear? And then we discovered they started opening up to us. They were sitting in credit meetings for 18-19 hours a day, just in panic with all different kinds of customers. And they were just trying to make sure that they were limiting, any loss. And once I understood where they were at a human and individual level, we could put those differences aside and start rebuilding that trust. But if we had untrusted relationships in everywhere in the business, the amount of time and effort that I put into rebuilding the trust with one supplier, it just would have been impossible to do that. So years of having built the trust with customers, with suppliers, just is what saved the day in our case.
Yeah. Miles, the idea of taking time out during a crisis to build trust and understand somebody else's position,
yeah,
as opposed to transact and meet requirements, that I think would be foreign to a lot of people.
Well, I loved Wendy's point. I'd never thought about it like this. There's so many good people and so many names I recognize on this call. But this idea of making yourself the project, because I personally experienced that. When I got angry with the bank at that stage, I had to say, well, this isn't going to help us at all. So I had to deliberately say, stop being angry. And then think, and then a couple of our non-exec board members that that I have access to, and some really wise people, they also just helped clarify the thinking, and then the process of getting into the shoes of the individuals at that bank and just understanding. And by the way, that wasn't me guessing. I asked them, what's driving you? What's the issue? What are you facing? I asked them on phone calls and Teams and Zoom calls, and they told me, and then said, well, how can I help you? And once I'd extended a hand to them, and then we started automating daily reports and pumping it straight through to them, that they, instead of them bugging us all the time, and gradually reducing the anxiety and rebuilding the trust. So this idea of making yourself the project is, if I was focused on some kind of righteous indignation about the injustice that was being done to us and allowed myself to be consumed by that, I wouldn't have done anybody any favors. I had to make myself the project. And there are many ways of doing this. I mean, the thing that I tease my team about is I now really try and get out for an hour a day during the day to get some proper exercise done. And in the beginning, I felt like a schoolboy playing truant, because, in my early 60s, all day, one of our exco members said, isn't it ironical? We used to use the word about we go to work. So you go to work. And he said, you got to drop that. I'm working. I work. or I exercise. You don't go to work anymore. You know, you're sitting at home. So again, this making yourself the project. If you're going to be sustainably available to your people, and you're not going to get sick, and you are not going to get tired or burnt out, you've got to put into your diary and have it respected by everybody. Go for a bicycle ride or a run or a gym session, a home gym session or whatever. And this is what we're also encouraging all of our people to do, that, saying, for Pete's sake, make me time, put it in your diary, advertise it, you know, get a roster going with your team, involve your manager. And we're saying to our managers, make sure your people are getting their me time. Our biggest concern is burnout and workaholism in our organization, because that's what happened. People didn't skive off. They just didn't stop working. You know, in that month of May, April and May, April in particular, you know, the long weekends, and people just, our organization, they just worked through. There wasn't an Easter or we had everybody was just working on new forecasts, new cash flows, new this. I mean, we just had, you know, being bombarded by questions from all over around our survival. So you have to let go and make yourself the project, where you say, I'm also making time for me and my family, and because I need to be able to perform in a sustainable way, and so, you know, I've got to laugh and watch TV in the evenings, or read a good book, or get on a Zoom call with, you know, your friends and have a drink, and family members, and that is so important. So this concept. So Wendy, I mean, I thank you for the thought, because we're starting to adopt that and use the term now inside Tarsus, is, are you making yourself the project?
Miles, I had a conversation with a client CEO yesterday, and this individual said to me, you know, I'm going to be taking some time off. So I said, that's great. I mean, what has led to this? And they said, well, I'm having more and more conflict, and I think partly the conflict's coming about because I'm just tired. And that's not a good reason to have conflict. You know, tough love is a good reason to have conflict. Standing up for what you believe in and what your principles are, these are good reasons to conflict with people. But conflicting because you're frustrated or tired is not a good idea. So, you know, what you're saying resonates. I want to get to some of the questions that have been sent through, if that's all right. The first one was actually sent through a couple of days ago, and it is this: what are your views on managing performance and output during this period? What are your views on managing performance and output?
Yeah, it's been extraordinary, because what's become so transparent with people working remotely and working, you know, on their own and using their own ingenuity, is just who is contributing and who's not. You know, when you've got everybody milling around an office, I mean, we had over, you know, one floor with about 400 people on it in Tarsus, in Johannesburg alone. And, you know, you see people sitting at their desks and they all look busy, but suddenly, you know, the outputs are there or they're not there. You know, I get my normal suite of daily dashboards on what's happening, what's not happening, and flags and so on. And I always used to tease about people and saying, you know, when you're the CEO, you're always the last one to find things out. But in this remote environment and spending more time on some of the indicators, I mean, the one thing we had to do really fast, we realized we were way too dependent on dashboards that reflected back at us historical data. What were yesterday's sales? You know, what moved? How much aged stock? How much stock aged yesterday? And we weren't spending nearly enough on dashboards that gave us the ability to do something about the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks. So, you know, so this cash flow forecast became our new, and there's so many moving parts in it. It was extremely complex. So it just highlighted instantly who's doing what. As I say, so the outputs became really important, as opposed to inputs and the appearance of busyness. And we've been planning some restructuring in our business, and we're cautiously implementing it, but it's gone. We've pulled the trigger on everything, and just gone, even reporting lines and teams and new roles, and and so on. And you know, as the dust has settled, we've needed to reshape the business entirely to address a market that's also changing and find out what's going on in the market. I mean, one of my colleagues, and he's on the call, Gary Pickford, and his teams, and also Anton Herbst, two other of my Exco members, they just fanatically spent the time on Teams meetings with their customers, and you know, their sales managers and their key account managers, and they spent days, 9-10 hours a day, just half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour at a time, just contacting customers. What are your experiences? What are your fears? And so on. This has stood us in such good stead. And then suddenly you're hearing it from them directly, and you get a sense of who's being looked after, who's been. So you know, your performance of salespeople, you're hearing directly from a customer, as opposed to maybe monitoring how many calls they've made in a day, or those traditional metrics. So I think it actually is all about outcomes and outputs. It's not monitoring that your staff are available from 8 till 5, because most of them are not. You know, we've had load shedding in between, and we still weren't fully prepared for load shedding. We hadn't been able to replace all these remote desktop machines with notebooks and UPSs and routers and so on, which we're in the process of doing. So, you know, just to make sure that people aren't totally dependent on short-term power. So yeah, that's a good thought, Ian.
Yeah. Wendy, any thoughts on that?
I'd just like to say very quickly that we've got a number of clients who have literally shifted, when we talk about performance, to we're focusing on deliverables, not time and attendance.
Yeah.
And that's wholly consistent with the legitimate leadership framework again, to say what you want to do is to define and agree with people the contribution they're going to be making going forward. And the leader's role is to actually enable them to make that contribution.
Yeah.
It's not about micromanaging people on activity.
Yeah. Yeah, Wendy, I had exactly that conversation with a client a couple of days ago, and I said to them at the end of it, I said, but you've got a problem. And your problem is that you actually haven't figured out how your people are adding value in this area. So you can't measure them on the value they're adding because you literally don't know. So that's your project. Figure out what their contribution is, and then you can start looking at performance. But until then, all you can do is look at the amount of time they're spending on, you know, on the phone or on a machine. One of the questions that has come up, Miles, is how did you actually manage the flow of information into the organization? Because that is tiring. It's exhausting.
Yeah. Well, we've got a team at Tarsus that does that. It's a very small team, but a very dedicated, very competent team. And you know, they were applying their minds, and it's always been a focus of ours. We've always, because of the whole legitimate leadership framework work that we were doing, you know, inductions of new staff starting every month, you know, we've always examined what we communicate. I mean, we've recently conducted wall-to-wall ethics training, ethics workshops, all that. So it's ongoing. You know, the communication with our people is ongoing. So I think, you know, right at an exco level, you know, a handful of people plus a very trusted advisor to us, you know, a contractor, consultant around communications and PR and so on, who advises us and helps us. We talked about it all of the time. What information needs to go to whom and when? You know, in the beginning, just informally, I relied a lot on emails, and the emails I sent from me personally to like a global email list, and made them personal notes with information around what we're doing and so on. I mean, you know, we were really lucky to have a grandchild born during this lockdown, and you know, little pieces like personal family news that I would put in a note to all of our staff to say, wow, I'm a grandfather now. I mean, isn't this amazing, and so on, and all the little banter and the congratulations that came back from staff members that I didn't have a personal relationship with previously. And and personally responding to every single email I received from a staff member and writing personal notes to them that had nothing to do with broadcasts or whatever, or putting them on my WhatsApp group and responding to them. So I've had so many more people at their initiative just create direct communication with me, regardless of their rank, and it's more around how they're feeling, what they're doing. I mean, I make a point of never interfering in managers' management of the business. The moment you do that, or you undermine a manager or take a decision for them, you've just shot yourself. In fact, you've shot your whole foot off in any organization. So, but just at a personal level, getting the personal communication going. And it just, there was a combination of structurally examining it and also just natural. And, my leadership team did the same. And they started doing, using Teams calls, with check-ins and games and people wearing silly hats and introducing to family members, and these are my kids and this is my dog. And, they started doing things like that. Just made it fun.
Yeah. Miles, I have a last question for you. Wendy, I'm not sure if you have a last question for Miles as well. But my last question comes up in the chat, which I've been trying to monitor, but haven't been doing a hugely successful job of. But there seems to be a bit of a trend around asking the question, what do you see as the next big leadership challenge, and how do we sustain? Because COVID-19 is not a flash in the pan crisis. And in fact, one of our associates said to us the other day, it's no longer a crisis, it's now reality. It was a crisis for the first 2 weeks. Now it's not a crisis. Yeah. How do we sustain? What's the next big opportunity for leaders?
Yeah, when you're in a crisis, you have to trust that people remember what the purpose of an organization is. Because you're not engaged now in a whole formal communication induction programs. Everybody, put a slide up. This is the purpose of the organization, missions, strategies, all sorts of things. But I do think it's important to come back once some of this dust has settled, and it hasn't settled fully. I mean, we've still got a lot to cope with, but not least of which is just a recession and shrinking businesses and potential bad debts, and there are other new risks. So I think what really is important is to go back and question, the purpose of an organization and re-examine it, and we're doing this in Tarsus now, and then engage with people to make sure they understand what their piece of the purpose is and how what they do does give them purpose. And so I think when you're in a crisis, your purpose is just to survive. We've kind of put a timeline on this with us to end of August. We're managing cash to end of August, and then we're back to all the traditional outcomes and returns and so on. So we will be from the 1st of September, just starting to rebuild the business and recoup some of the damage that's been done from massive lost revenue. But for now, it's been quite short-term stuff. So we will spend a lot of time re-examining and re-communicating and re-engaging with our people on the purpose of the organization. And the purpose isn't just, in our case, supply computers. I always love in the legitimate leadership framework this concept of inversion of means and ends. In other words, the end is a developed person, a happy person, and if we treat our staff, so we're doing lots and lots of work on what's our employee value proposition and what are we doing for them, and the organization itself and its tasks and so on are the means to develop and bring people on board. And I mean, we could have a whole session just on that and what our responsibility is in Africa. But I think we haven't lost sight of that. That's core to us. We remind ourselves all the time of what this outcome that we need to do, this profit that we want to achieve. That's the means. The outcome really is our people, and if that's wrapped within a purpose for an organization that people understand is a benevolent purpose, then it really does help. It gives you the right conversations to have with your people.
Miles, you mentioned that we could have a whole nother conversation about this, and as a pre-warning, I may well give you a call and ask you if you could do exactly that. There's so much more that I'd love to pick your brain on.
Well, it always works two ways. And when I sit and I know people are listening, and you have to be careful how you are explaining things. You're also teaching yourself. This thing of making yourself the project. You're having to crystallize things that you might not have thought through. So it's extremely helpful. I'd love to. And I'd love to hear from some of the people on this call, what they're. So I've also read the chat and just seen, and I'm sorry we haven't got to everybody, but I'd be perfectly happy to engage with the individuals on the chat afterwards and talk these things through.
Fantastic. Thank you, Miles. Wendy, any last thoughts? I know you've been working with clients on this through our programs.
No, I guess my last thought, and you did say we're focusing this particular call on trust, on courage, on empowerment, more than we're focusing on compassion and care. And I think what is the real challenge going ahead is all this good stuff that leaders have shown during the crisis. How do they make sure they just don't revert back to focus on results post the crisis? How do they continue making people their priority? And be bold, be brave, and just be as courageous as you have been now into the future would be my last word on the subject.
Right. Fantastic, Wendy. Thank you very much. Miles, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll see you online again. I look forward to catching up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will try to get back to you on your questions that you put in the chat. Really appreciate it. This will be available as a recording afterwards as well. Great, thank you, and have a lovely Thursday.
Yeah, thanks, Miles.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody who tuned in. That was really very kind of you.
Fantastic.